Hi, I'm Hansi Herzog. Welcome to Co-Create and welcome to another network talk. So today we have Michel Bauwens with us from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. I'm very happy that you're here. Thank you very much for showing up, and you will introduce yourself in a minute. So for you, welcome on board to the Global Co-Creation Challenge. Our vision is to unite the world community so we're able to co-create a good life for all. To do so and to surround this topic with more flash and take different angles of perspective, we do these regular network talks or expert interviews to give you insights about different topics, different approaches, and different already existing organizations out there. So from the organizational, what's inside for you today? So you will get to know about the concept of peer-to-peer as well as commons, and you will get to know very specifically the work of the peer-to-peer foundation. I'm looking much, I'm looking forward very much to the conversation with, because the peer-to-peer foundation shows up in many things I am communicating in or about. So I'm really, really interesting and looking forward to. Before we get started, just as an organizational overview, we are streaming right now to Facebook, so you can use the comment section below to get in conversation with us. We're very happy to take up your questions or ideas. Please share. And also, if you see this later on YouTube, we record this, so feel free to share your questions and comments there. We're always looking forward to get into conversation with you. It will be around 1 hour, plus minus. And yeah, let's get started. Please, Michel, introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks for inviting me. So basically, I'm from Belgium, but I live in northern Thailand right now, which is a pretty good place to live during COVID. So yeah, I founded the P2P Foundation, which has the aim to be an organized network of people interested in two things: peer-to-peer and the commons. So maybe I briefly explain what that means. So peer-to-peer means the capacity that we today have to connect, billions of human beings and allow them to communicate together, to organize themselves, but also to create new forms of value creation and distribution. So to briefly explain this, imagine you are in a village, in the first 500,000 years of human history. Everybody would be your kin. You would know everybody. You would have the elders and the shaman, and so basically, you can solve your issues within the tribe through communication. But once we get bigger, and there's an anthropologist who says we can remember 150 people and trust them. So then we get hierarchy, because hierarchy is a kind of simplification of communication, where only some people need to communicate and not everybody with everybody. And so what's interesting today with this technology is that we can scale up small scale collaboration. I know it sounds a bit contradictory, but for example, you look at Linux, the free software alternative to Microsoft and Apple. So what you would see is actually that, maybe 30,000 people are working on it, combining hundreds of companies and maybe 25,000 developers, but the average team is just 4 people. And that's very remarkable. So there's no central command. And yet today humanity is able to do these very, very complex ways of working together at scale. And so recently with the blockchain, but I want to stress that it doesn't have to be blockchain, but the idea of distributed ledgers, right? So we already had the Internet of Communication, and now we have an Internet of Transactions. And that means that everything we did until now, which was sharing knowledge, sharing software, and sharing design making, that was all immaterial, things that we could do purely on the computer. But now that we have accounting and logistics, now we can actually coordinate physical production. And so that's kind of my latest line of inquiry, is to look at different projects and prototypes, experimentations, and real projects that are moving in that direction and creating open collaborative systems that can produce for human need, but within taking account the planetary boundaries and the ecological limits. Then the second term that I should briefly explain is the commons. And this is when you engage in this peer-to-peer way. And basically, if I freely engage and you freely engage, then you're not going to tell me what I have to do. We have to find some kind of agreement as peers, right? And so what this promotes is actually the creation of commons, shared goods. So commons is defined as any resource that is shared, that is produced or maintained by a community or a group of stakeholders, and that creates its own norms and regulations. And that distinguishes it from both from the state form and the market form. And so generally speaking, and I'm finishing my introduction, is that we're moving from a binary world where we have to choose between markets and states, where civil society is not really, a central actor, to a new vision that is based not on commodities and state authority, but on contributions, a contributory value regime, where people are judged on their capacity and willingness to contribute to some common project. And then around that project, we create economies. I hope you didn't hear that. Somebody's trying to call me via Skype, which I can't control. I'm sorry. And yes, so I lost my thread. But so you see, right? You have a core of value creation, which is now contributory. All the people contributing as peers to this common resource. They create economies around them which have to work for the commons. They have to be generative vis-a-vis the commons. And you can see the commons as human commons or as extra-human commons, right? As kind of agreements between humans and other living species, because we are interdependent of each other. And then the third thing that is happening is that we're creating organizations that manage these infrastructures. And those are, if you know about open source software, these are the FLOSS foundations, Free Libre Open Source Software Foundations. And I call them for benefit organizations. They don't tell anybody what to do, but they maintain the capacity of the ecosystem to continue to work together. Example would be the Wikimedia Foundation, which doesn't tell anybody in the Wikipedia what to write, but maintains the servers and the organization around the Wikipedia. And this is not just like micro, for me this is macro. This is how the world is evolving. This is a new model, a post-capitalist civilization and economic model.
Thank you for introducing yourself on the one side and the two main topics you're speaking about. So we have the peer-to-peer and the commons, and I already see there, I think there are open up a field where we can attach a lot of other words like prosumer or cooperativism, or let's say before we spoke about transition. So maybe some people are not calling it commons or peer-to-peer, but transition, but it's something very similar. The systems are very similar.
People are groping for change, and so they start from a particular perspective, and the perspective can be post-growth, degrowth, transition. In the end, it's groping in the same direction, and so transition thinkers will discover the commons, and degrowth will discover the commons, and if you're a commoner, you discover degrowth, and each perspective sheds light on a particular aspect of reality, but doesn't see other things. And so the best thing is to mix perspectives. The only thing that we are saying, which is a bit different, is that we believe that the next form of society will be common-centric, not market-centric and not state-centric, but common-centric, with a generative economy that serves the commons, and with a partner state model and enabling and facilitating common good institution that facilitates the value creation in the commons. It's quite a radical concept, because when you talk about contributions, it means two things. First of all, we don't believe that only commodities create value. Commodities are based on scarcity. So basically you get wealthy today through extraction of some good that is scarce and you can sell on the market. And you don't take into account all the contributions from people and nature that you don't have to pay for. Domestic work, pollution. And so the negative impacts are also not included in the current economic model. Like basically corporations don't pay for the negative externalities which have to be paid by civil society or the state. Once you say that it's about contributions, basically you start thinking that every citizen is a contributor. There's not a person in the world that doesn't contribute in some way or other to enriching the life of our planet. And also does damage to the planet, right? So you have to take both into account. So the image is of an economy which fully takes into account externalities as opposed to ignoring them and pushing them on the side. That's basically the key idea of a contributive value regime.
Thank you for pointing out this again. And I would like to go back to something you said before. We just create awareness for that there are many different perspectives we can look on the same thing. And I wonder what's your experience with that? Because for Co-Create, one important belief is that for doing the next big step in the change, it's very, very important that we raise a shared awareness. So we speak about the world community. So creating awareness where we see that those different fields and perspectives are so close together that we learn to move and organize as one big movement. People say the movement of movement, the network of networks. We really have to build bridges between our boundaries. And because it's so obviously that we want to reach out for the same goal, but there are brands and beliefs which are spreading us. And I think that is something where we lose a lot of energy. So what do you think about that, and what's your experience in the past, or what do you see would help us to overcome this?
Yes, it's a very difficult issue because I do think that generally speaking, we are very fragmented. So every movement, works on its own, wants to augment its influence, and also, just personal egos. This is my project, not yours, and the advantage of open source is in part an answer to that, right? Is that like when you do an open source project, you make something together and you're bound by a common love of that object. So sometimes I talk about object-oriented sociality. And so if you do free software, for example, you have to work with libertarian developers, with conservative developers. There are all kinds of ideologies around, but you still have to work together because you are working on this concrete thing. And also very important in the open source and commons model is that it's really global because knowledge today is globally networked. So that's you reach scale, and there's different ways to reach scale. And one of the ways to reach scale is through common patterns, right? If you think about Occupy and 15M in 2011, that was like the first time that we had a social movement that was basically a set of patterns. So I call these protocol cooperatives. Go on a square, use the mic check. They had different rules, and then you could say I'm Occupy or I'm 15M. But this is the same when we produce things. We have these patterns that create a system, and then people join and accept those patterns, right? So that, at least in practical terms, is how we can scale. So, for example, one of my proposals is so we're going to have to mutualize a lot of provisioning systems. What that means is that certainly in the West, we are way over our ecological footprint, right? We are over the carrying capacity of the planet. And the best way to diminish our usage of matter and energy is through mutualization, commoning. So there's a movement that is called Factor 20 production. And for example, they just published a study recently where, if you do cargo bikes and electric bikes, you can basically do the same amount of transportation of goods in a city with 98% less energy. Amazing, right? So, so I think we will need to do this globally, but then it doesn't make sense that every city does it on its own, right? So we talk about cosmo-local, and that means you are really embedded in your locality, because we shouldn't forget that even if we are global, that we can only heal the earth locally. But we can learn from everybody else. That's the important point. So as we do it locally, like with our feet in the mud doing permaculture, at the same time, our brain is connected with a global network of all permaculturists. And so we're learning from advances in the whole world. So I think that's the model that we have to follow, is that we have to combine the geographical model, because we are rooted somewhere, wherever we are, but we learn, and the world isn't organized that way yet, right? We are in a geographically managed world with, nation states. But what we could do, for example, is create a league of cities that all want to mutualize their provisioning system. They want more shared mobility, more shared housing, etc., etc. And so then they create a global open design community, which is a depository of all these protocols that everybody needs. All the successful patterns of everywhere in the world are collected. And then people use that open source and they actually practice it locally, and they change it, they adapt it, they make it better, and then they share it again. I think this is a very powerful model to combine both local diversity, but at the same time, not losing all the advantages of a cultural, technical, and scientific globalization. What's wrong with the current form of globalization is that we move too much matter. So we spend 3 times as much matter energy to transport and to make. And that's why we have to really turn that around. We have to, produce much more locally. And one word that I use for that is cosmo-local production and the subsidiarity of material production. What's the most local way to make something that makes sense? Sometimes it doesn't make sense to do it locally. So it's not like a fanatic localization, but it is a smart localization. We really have to think, if you're in Patagonia, why should you import butter from New Zealand? Doesn't make any sense in that particular case. And anyway, so political unity is a lot more difficult even than that, because what's more easy when you do something practical is that you can unite around some practical goal, and put political conflicts under brackets. It's much more difficult when you go into politics. But to a certain degree, our world will have to be pluralistic, so that people can try out different forms and see what works, see what doesn't work. And what we do in the P2P Foundation, I think, is important, because what we're doing is we're recording, all these different experiments, right? And in order to be in our wiki, you have to exist. So we don't take things that people would be nice. No, it would be nice. It's fine. You have to try it. Utopia is good. But in our wiki, we actually look at real projects. And then we look at all these projects in a particular domain, and we try to find the commonalities, right? And that creates common knowledge. And you can create a pattern language, which is, the best of something in some domain that other people should know about. And then people can build on each other.
Nice. Therefore, it's really, I just in myself, I'm connecting to co-create and the model and the approach we developed through the last 3 years, and how many commonalities I see there. So I'm very happy to have another look on that as well later on. For now, I would really love to hear more about the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and what you are doing. You were just starting to explain a little bit, so I think we have already quite a nice understanding of the commons and the peer-to-peer principle. Also how the connection between local and global is. I think that's something very important when we speak about that. Also open source is one of the words really fits in very nice here. So maybe you can explain a little bit more, what is the peer-to-peer foundation for? What are you doing? How are you supporting? Which role are you taking in this process?
Yeah, so the we're basically a network of researchers and advocates of peer-to-peer in the commons. So we are present in the whole world. We have people in India, in South Africa, in really a lot of places. And we share this common interest in studying and promoting this model. And one of the things we do is because we also need to make a living, is that a lot of our researchers are involved in European research consortia. And why is this interesting? Because I'm more the visionary of in the movement. But when I conclude something because I see the evidence, then it's very good to do participatory action research and to actually verify, is that really right? So the fact that we have so many peer-reviewed articles that you can find when you do a Google search, Google Scholar search, is very good for our legitimacy, because it means that what I'm saying is not just like the idea of one person, but is actually backed up by research. So that's a thing we are doing continuously. Just gives you an example. We have something a few years ago. We did P2P value. So we look at 300 peer production communities, that peer produced, like I explained in the beginning, through commons and open source methodologies. And we found that 75% of them were using a new form of accounting that we call contributory accounting. That I didn't have I knew it existed, but I didn't know so many people were already doing it, right? So that interaction between theory and practice is really, really fruitful. Now, today I'll give you two examples of two things we're working on. One is the past and one is the future. So I've become increasingly convinced that there is a cyclic pattern around thermodynamics. So most of the modern economists don't look at this. They think there's an economy and that's it. But our economy is based on matter and energy that is subject to the two laws of thermodynamics. And I'm not a scientist, but I'll briefly try to explain. So the first law is that you can exchange one energy to another, the law of conservation of energy. And the second law, is that if you use matter, it degrades. And so overall, the system is degrading over time. And the more you use it, the more you degrade it. And that's very important for the economy because so what happens is that any market state entity is geared towards consumptive expansion. So that means they will use more and more of their resources, their regional resources, and they will exhaust it. So you have a degradative part of the cycle. Then you have some kind of overshoot and collapse, and that sets in as a reaction. And the reaction is a regenerative reaction. The people who are on the ground, the farmers, they say, we have to survive. And so they're going to look for things that work, for them in their local environment. And that sets in a healing period. And so there's many different schools that will confirm that. For example, bioeconomics, which is the thermodynamic economic school. Then you have Peter Turchin, that's called cryodynamics, because he looks at time and the patterns in time. Comes to the same conclusion. Karl Polanyi looks within capitalism based on what's called the Kondratiev cycles, about 60 years. And he sees the same within capitalism. And, we're now in the sixth cycle. So this goes on and on in human history, is that, civilization rises, declines, another one rises, declines. And what we've done with capitalism is that we made the system global. So we thought
Mhm.
we escaped the cycle. And we escaped the cycle because of fossil fuels and technological innovation on the one side, but also because of frontiers. If we exhausted one region, we just went to another, right? And that's the end game. There's no more frontiers, and actually we can no longer use fossil fuels without worry because of climate change.
Mhm.
So that means that this kind of limit we are now facing all together at a global scale, and that's new. But that also means that the commons are back on the agenda in a big way.
Mhm.
So, we see this kind of revival of commoning periodically in history. And I want to give you a little anecdote because a few people knew that. But the most important Catholic ritual in the Middle Ages were called the gang days of beating the bounds and the Rogentide procession. And what is it about? It's every year the people in the parish would do a procession around the village and reconfirm their commons. And then they would, beat the bounds. I mean, they would put these milestones to say
Mhm.
this is from us collectively. In other words, a big part of their identity was their commons. They confirmed their common interdependence of the commons every year within a very important community ritual. So just to show you how important that was, in pre-capitalist times. And that is coming back. So what we see today is exponential rise in open source. We
Mhm.
see an exponential rise in urban commoning. So I did a study in Ghent in northern Belgium, but it's confirmed in many other regions and cities, a tenfold increase in urban commons in 10 years, from 2008 to 2016. Um, and now I look at, cosmolocal physical production, and I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's called the multi-factory model. In Europe, you now have 120 places where artisans come together, find a cheap place like abandoned factories, mutualize their work. They have an invisible factory where they all share their knowledge. And we're publishing a book next March about cosmolocal production with 40 examples of that nature to show that this is also growing. So if you look at the mainstream world, there's many reasons to be pessimistic, right? Because it's a period of disintegration. A
Yes.
phase transition is a disintegration. We have a stable system. Before it can become a new stable system, it has to fragment first. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing the fragmentation of politics, of economics. Everything that we thought we could rely on is actually, disaggregating.
Mhm.
And so we had under capitalism we had merchant capitalism, which was the first globalization that got interrupted with Napoleon and the French Revolution. There was 30 years of war, and then it became the Smithian capitalist system, which disintegrated in 1914, and we got 30 years of war. And since 45, we had, the social democratic and the neoliberal, these two phases of that system, and that is now disintegrating. However, if you are placing yourself on the point of view of a change maker, right? It's the famous butterfly analogy, right? You have the caterpillar, it's going to become mush. So if you think as a caterpillar, that's very bad. You're dying. But you have the cells, the imaginal cells in the DNA that point to the butterfly. So if you
Mhm.
can if you can place yourself on the point of view of the imaginal cells, if you can see the future, not predict it, but as a visionary,
Mhm.
then you have a lot more psychological force, and more people need to do that. That's what basically I think COVID is about. COVID is by itself not such a bad thing. It's not like the plague where 80% of people died. It's something lighter, but because we disassembled all our social systems under neoliberalism, we
It
can't
raises
cope with it.
awareness, right?
Yeah. And so I see 2020 as really a pivot year of disaggregation. and I see 2021 as the beginning of a massive shift of many, many people towards alternative solutions because they have no choice, right? They say, oh wow, if we're going to survive this, I have to find, what's my community? Who's going to support me when I'm in trouble? And I'm not sure I'm right about this, but my intuition is that there's not so much we can ask from the state at this point, right? Because this is not a growing state with more and more capacity to share. We are actually in a time of losing, funding, and so this means commoning is going to be really a crucial part of surviving the next few decades. Um,
So yeah,
so that
thank
was the
you.
past. I want to do
Yeah, the
something. I want
past.
to
So
say
you
something about the
also the
future as
past
well.
and
Yeah,
now. So what's up
yeah.
next?
So, so one of the things we did in 2019, we published it in 2020, and now we are about to finish a funding round to do the next step. Is what is a realistic cyber physical infrastructure to produce for human needs within planetary boundaries? And I know if you're familiar with the idea of Kate Wayworth and the donut,
Donor
which
economy.
says you have yeah. So the donut economy means you have a social floor. That means that you have to take care of people because otherwise they revolt. If only for that, if only for the most selfish reasons, you have to take care of a social floor. And then you have the ecological ceiling, which means that you cannot take care of people by destroying the planet. And so we have to stay in between, which she calls the safe and just uh, what's the safe zone for human development. Okay, so that's for me a given. So we looked at what people are doing and we found that accounting is changing, and this is a very important story because accounting is how we see the world. So the first accounting we found in Sumeria in Mesopotamia, and this is basically the invention of the state. You had these temples that were stocking the grain and counting the grain coming in and coming out. And I don't know if you know this because I found this interesting. People used writing not to speak. It was accounting. So for years and years and years, people didn't use written language to talk, to engage in. No, it was just counting. That was important. But then in the 15th century, Lucio Paccio, which was a Franciscan monk, he invented double entry book accounting. And this is the invention of capitalism because what you start looking at the world, this is coming in, this is going out, and I'm making a profit. My capital goes up. And so now we have three new forms of accounting: contributive accounting. So basically, if you engage in open source, what you want is not that a few people that are connected to the market, get rewarded. You want the whole network to be rewarded. So what you do is you build a membrane around your collective work, and you say, we will record the contribution. And then when the money comes in, either from subsidies or from selling stuff on the market, you can redistribute them according to this contributory logic. So I call this value sovereignty, which is the ability to decide for yourself what has value and what has not value. The second form of accounting that is emerging is flow accounting. So it's no longer about what's coming in and out of me, and you don't take into account nature and externalities. No, it's about what does this transaction mean in terms of our open collaborative ecosystem. So this is called REA, resources, events, agents. And then the third form of accounting, and I recommend to read a really wonderful document. It's called From Mono-Capitalism to Multi-Capitalism from r30.org. And so these people, they have the following reasoning, right? So now the problem with capitalism is that the financial is prioritized over everything else. So as a CEO, you can go to jail if you mismanage your capital, but you can hurt people and nature doesn't have much influence on how you will be judged. Multi-capitalism is the idea that we should value humans and nature as much as financial capital. So you would make people in organizations and companies and co-ops responsible for how they treat human communities and extra human communities. And so this is called thermodynamic accounting because it implies a capacity to seeing the flows of matter and energy on their own. So it's not about pricing nature. This is different. This is about the ability to see, and so they use the word non-fungibility, which means they're not transferable from one to the other. Because this is what capitalism does today. Conscious capitalism, natural capitalism, they all think, oh, I can do so much damage here as long as I compensate over there. No. There's things that you destroy, they're gone. They're not fungible. You have to look them on their own, and even without monetization. If there can be just volumes, right? So the idea is they're working on a global thresholds and allocations council, which is a group of scientists keeping track of volumes, stocks, and flows of materials. And then that then goes into all the accounting systems, and then it's called context-based sustainability. So in any context, you have to know as a human group how much you can use from the environment without destroying it. So this is what I want to do this year in the summer, is look at the history of this, and this is called cybernetics and systems and complexity thinking. And then you have Soviet planning. So I want to look at it again and see, what went wrong and what worked and what didn't work. And then look at CyberSyn, which was a really interesting project in Chile in 1973 with Stafford Beer, who was a complexity theorist, and he had made a system in Chile that was able to manage the economy, from a dashboard. And when Pinochet organized his coup, the first thing they did before attacking the palace was destroying and bombing CyberSyn. Interesting historical anecdote. And then I want to look at today, which is what open sources and the commons are bringing to the table, which is stigmergic collaboration. That means the capacity to work together based on signaling, like the bees and the ants, because that's what open source is. Everything is an open, collaborative, holoptical, so the ability to see the whole, and every individual can adapt his behavior because he has a systemic view. So if you want to write an article for the Wikipedia, nobody has to tell you. You just can go to an article and say, that's not correct. And you can contribute because you can see it. You can see it's wrong. And then in the future, I want to look at OpenAI, data commons, data co-ops to see how we can, because data is crucial, right? That this is how we're gonna do these complex things, is by also having, and capitalism was expulsing people from the means of production. Feudalism was about expulsing people from the land, and cognitive capitalism is about expulsing people from data ownership. So this is the crucial thing that we need today, and we don't own it. We give it away. So if we want this to work, we also need to think about data ownership and collective data ownership, mutual data ownership, and how open AI and transparent algorithms can make this whole system work. So that's kind of, I don't have all the answers yet because we're just starting, but this is what we'll do this year. So each year we have like a theme, and we try to mobilize a few people around, so that every year we can say, we did something that is, what we are gifting, if you like, to the world.
Okay, thank you for this overview. And may I ask a little bit more in detail when you say you do something regarding a topic? So, what is your doing? What is your action? Is it like collecting experts, having discussions, writing papers? What can people imagine what you are actually doing?
Right. Well, the first thing is actually collecting. So, and that's I'm personally quite good at that. I'm a librarian. I've been a librarian for 12 years before I started doing this. So it's kind of a special mindset. I record everything. That's the basic rule. So before I can do something, I will have spent 18 months collecting.
Mhm,
So to give you an example, we did a report on contributory accounting, but when I started doing this last summer, we had, already 450 examples collected in our database. And nobody else has that. Most people don't even know it exists. But if you look at all these weak signals all together, that's a strong signal, right? It's because we have a global view. And when you see, let's take permaculture. Okay, permaculture, maybe it's a few hippies. No, no, you have like 4,000 communities in the world. That's no longer a few hippies.
mhm,
That's the world changing, all over the place, right? So when you collect this, you start seeing, oh, something is happening, right? And so then the second phase would be make a synthesis of what we have. And
mhm,
then if we have funding, that's the third phase is collecting a bigger team and go deeper, or waiting for the right EU project
mhm,
to insert that in an EU project and get funded that way. So we've been doing this since 2014. I've been so far, it's worked every year that somehow, we find the funding because we're not well funded. We have a very weak funding, structural funding,
mhm.
but somehow because we keep innovating, people are interested, and so they ask us to be part of consortium. And then, of course, we can have an influence on the description of the work, and we can insert our own interests. And that's basically, yeah, how we work.
Wow, cool. Very interesting. Thank you. And you said you're going deeper, so I will ask and go deeper with you. What are you doing if you go deeper into one topic? I often heard already from you the word patterns, so maybe it's something about the pattern work. Maybe you want to introduce the concept of pattern as well, because you mentioned more
Yeah.
often before, and I think it's quite
Well,
important.
I don't use it methodologically, but the original work was Christopher Alexander called A Pattern Language, and he was more like an architect or an urbanist, and he noticed that places where people wanted to live were characterized by what he called biophilic patterns. So patterns that were conducive to life and social life.
Mhm,
And places where people didn't like to live and were getting sick if they had to live there, he called them biopathic patterns.
mhm,
And then basically, they started formalizing that as a pattern language, which is basically you take something and you ask a few key questions. How does it work? Why does it work? What are the components? And then you start documenting that. And so today, many communities are doing that. For example, the Salesians, which is a Catholic order which does education for the poor, and they have 2,000-3,000 people in the world. They have a Salesian pattern language. What is working within their schools. Why is this interesting? Because it's teachable, right? Once you have a successful pattern, you can document it, 1, 2, 3, 4 examples, and then other people can read it and apply it and improve it. So I don't do it very formally because I don't have the time to do it professionally. But basically, in our wiki, that's pretty much what we're doing. And so, for example, I look at post-corporate entities, right? So these would be economic ecosystems that are no longer corporations. And I will start collecting them and try to find out why they're working. What are they innovating? So I look at Ethos Foundation and Spiral. Fora do Eixo in Brazil.
Mhm.
And so slowly but surely you keep collecting, you keep thinking about what you're collecting. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is very important if you want to learn. Uh, so there is a famous book. It's called Memory Castles by Francis Yates. So in the Middle Ages, people didn't have enough paper. And writing a book at the time was like the equivalent of $160,000 to make one book, because these monks had to spend years writing a book. And so they would basically imagine a castle, different floors. Each floor has left and right. Each floor has 8 rooms, and each room has a library, right?
Mhm.
And they would place their knowledge in a particular place. What that does is it anchors your knowledge. And I do that all the time because I'm a librarian. So I use Digo for social bookmarking. I use my wiki as an external brain. And so
Mhm.
that means two things. That means that you see something, you can anchor it. It's because otherwise, it goes in one ear, it goes out in the other, right? If you anchor it, your chances of remembering it, but also you're structuring your knowledge. So you're engaged in meaning making and sense making. And then this is interesting. You will see things that don't fit. And
Mhm.
that's being, innovation. What's happening? I don't get it. So then you get a signal that, oh, there's something happening there that I cannot integrate in my system. So I
Mhm.
have to completely reorganize my system and adapt it at a higher level of integration in order to be able to understand this innovation, right? And that's how you keep growing. So your kind of system co-evolves with your knowledge. And of course, it's never finished. It's never, this is a truth. But it's a mutual adaptation between your brain and the world. And it's, you try to go on with that. And probably as you get older, you start forgetting more things, and that's unfortunate. But you also start seeing more patterns, and that's really good. Because you're seeing, even if you forget the details, you have a clearer view of the underlying systems and structures that hold everything together.
Yeah, thank you for laying out your understanding of patterns. I would like to add or to resume that for me it's like, and I think you reflected to this function already. For me, it's like a pattern is a knowledge brick which we can replicate and use in different situations. So I think what happens in the open source scene is quite connected to the pattern thing. In the IT development, pattern is very much implemented. But for me, it's really like you can have a pattern to everything and replicate it like a blueprint. It's like how does a
Yep.
community garden works, or how do we do good facilitation? Can be described in a pattern
Yeah.
language. It can be replicated and can be compared to other quite similar approaches. So we can see, okay, what is similar in this and this approach, and what are the common things. And therefore, I think
Yeah.
it's very interesting for knowledge building, knowledge management, and making knowledge and solutions implementable. So probably I would love to make another interview regarding the topic of patterns, but that's another story. Um, so you mentioned already as well, and I would like to hear a little bit more from you about your wiki. So the Peer-to-Peer Foundation has a wiki. I posted the link already here in the comments. I know it had been there for quite many times because links are often referring to the wiki. Maybe you want to explain a little bit how you developed it or what's the
Um,
goal with it. So,
yeah, well, the wikis are a depository, of everything we see. So concepts, people, techniques, basically everything. And then we use the Media Wiki, which is the software of the Wikipedia, which is very, very easy to use. I basically learned it in 15 minutes. It was really easy. But then, so what you do is you give it a category tag. For example, P2P accounting, right? And that creates an encyclopedia. So every time you put that category tag, you actually create a section page. And then I use a section page to make sense of the database. So I will say, okay, these are the 3 introductory articles. These are articles for advanced people. I would collect quotes, statistics, and so that people, when they come to see that section, it's not just a long list of, an encyclopedia, but it actually structures your knowledge as well. It's not visually attractive. I'm a text guy. I'm just, I do text, and so that's not for everyone. But we have probably about 100 million visitors so far.
Wow.
So it's used. It's really used, and I know for many people that tell me, we use a wiki regularly, um, and we have a pretty high Google search score. They give you like some kind of like grade, and we have 6, and I'm told that is like really good. Um, I think 8 is the maximum. I'm not sure how it works, but anyway, somebody told me that was really good. So that means that we also findable through Google search. And then people would find the page, and then they see the category under, and then if they want more, they can go to the category page, and they can educate themselves on this particular domain. So the way it's organized is we have peer production, peer governance, and peer property. Those are 3 key categories. Like, how do you produce together? How do we govern our communities together, and how do we protect our work, our property? Commons-based property regimes and stuff like that. And then we look at how it is applied in society. So we have P2P state approaches, P2P market approaches, and P2P civil society approaches. And then we look how it is deployed in domains: art, education, spirituality. We cover everything. We're not everything, but a bit of everything, because it's. So I used to say that peer-to-peer is a total social fact. That means it influences everything. It doesn't leave anything untouched, just as the printing press revolution didn't leave anything untouched. And this is at the same level. This is a very deep intervention in human anthropology. This is, changing, and doesn't mean changing everything for the good, right? But it's changing. And the more we become aware of it, the more we can smoothen the transition. That's the thing, right? If you can accompany it, manage it, have the right policies. So I look a lot at public commons cooperation protocols. What's the best? So here's my reasoning. We have capitalism because we had capitalists, right? So you have medieval cities were relatively free, and so the merchant guilds could become strong without too much state control. So they created their own culture, and they started adapting the world to their own needs. And eventually that became capitalism. And as commoners, we have to do the same. How do we transform the economy so that it works for us? How do we transform public authority so that it works for us? And so slowly but surely, we imprint the world that we live in with a new value system that we need to thrive, right? And of course, how to do this, what's the best way? There's huge debates within the movement. You have radical revolutionaries, you have reformists, you have all kinds of people, right? You can't avoid these debates. I'm more pragmatically oriented. Okay, so what I'm saying is we need to make a living, because we also have a lot of commoners that are more like, I call them hippie commoners. They're fine with volunteering and they don't want any link with the market. And I'm saying, no, you can't do that, because that means you will always be marginal. So we have to be better than them, and we have to collect surplus value better than them. So how do we do that? And it's a very pragmatic approach. Like what works, what doesn't work. You know, don't attack something that you know you're going to lose. So start with low hanging fruit first, consolidate yourself, and then go for the next step.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all of that is debatable. There's all kinds of people within the movement, but that's kind of the approach that we take. It's like we think we have to make a living from this. And what do we need to make a living from this?
Think I like your approach very much. I know this different parts in the movement as well very well. And yeah, I share your opinion very much, because if you want to scale up, if you want to really reach out to a broad sector of society, we need the resources to do so. I think more and more people are realizing this also in our alternative phase. For me, it doesn't mean that in future we cannot live without money or just based on sharing economy, but to come to this future, I think we need the resources to operate within or beside the system we are living in right now.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. You know, you can demonetize a lot of things, and if you want that and you can do it, I'm totally fine with that. Some other things you actually need financial resources because a lot of people outside don't want to exchange, without monetary intervention. But I'll give you an example. So that's from our report from 2019. Like the fish coin. So that's a cryptocurrency that tells you how much fish can be fished without endangering the reproduction of the fish. So I find that very interesting because it's an intelligent currency. It's a currency. It sees the current, uh, and so that's better than a monetary system which doesn't tell you anything about externalities. It's just blind, right? So even though that's a market thing, fish coin is a market coin, if you like, it brings something new and generative, and it can help save the fish. Maybe there are other solutions, but I'm pragmatic about this. If it's an improvement, I think this is something we should try and advance, and then we'll take the next step.
Nice, yeah. Step by step, right? And
Yeah.
especially, I think we need all steps we can have in the right direction. So there
Yes.
are different steps and different sizes of steps at the same time. And for me and co-create, it's always about gathering all possibilities. We don't have to, and I think that's a big issue, that if we discuss within our communities, we lose energy to make the steps. So it's not about discussing if
But
or.
that's what open source exactly. But that's what open source brought to to our reality, which is the old left way was about discussing together, having a majority, and then everybody has to do the same thing. There's one solution, and they always split because they don't agree on what that solution is. What open source does is says just try it, and if it's good enough, we'll integrate it in the system, right? So if you look at the hierarchy in open source communities, it's not a command hierarchy, it's a control hierarchy. The maintainers and the editors in Wikipedia are people who protect the ecosystem. They protect the integrity of the ecosystem. This says this article is good enough or is not good enough. This solution, this software solution, is good enough or not good enough, right? So everybody is free to try and prototype and experiment to present it, and then it will be integrated or not. But you have the full freedom to do it, and you don't have to discuss it. You only discuss when you have to, which is when you have some conflict that you need solution for. Instead of discussing everything all the time, which is enormously, a loss of energy. So this combination of community and individualism, I think, is very, very interesting in how that works in open source. It's a good balance between the two polarities, as opposed to choosing one or the other. You bring them together for what they're both good at.
Yeah. I have an interesting point here and question to you, because on the one side, I'm totally with what you said so far, what I brought up before. But at the other side, what I see by if you just start a new thing, like you can go into this tendency like, okay, your approach is quite nice, but I have a small idea what I would like to change. So I start a new project, a new platform, and another one, another one. And what I see right now in the, let's call it the infrastructure of change right now, that we have many platforms out there which are quite similar, which are most of them lacking out of resources. So they are not able to develop a tool which is really as good as we would like to see as users. And there are too many tools out there fishing in the same sea for the same fishes, and they die because they don't reach this track, like reach enough people to
Yeah.
use. So there again, I see that sometimes it's important to bring some projects together to gain more energy. How do you see
Yeah.
that, and what is your experience in the open source scene around this topic?
Well, okay, I'm not sure it's going to work, but I think that in many ways the blockchain communities are attempting to do this. I live in Chiang Mai, as I told you in the beginning, and this is the, at least before COVID, was the world capital of nomadic work. So we had a Facebook group with 25,000 digital nomads in Chiang Mai. So all people are working remotely. A lot of them are doing Mozilla Foundation work, blockchain, Bitcoin. It's a whole scene around here. And many other people in that community come from open source and they actually do blockchain because they wanted to solve the economic issue, which is that a lot of people, weren't paid. So the token system is really, the way I see it, is a system of micro shares. So you launch the tokens, and I think here's the genius already. They keep 40% for the work, which I don't think any Marxist movement has ever succeeded in doing that. Giving 40% for the workers. That's radical. Okay, then they open up the financing, right? So it's not just one bank, one venture capital. It's a crowdfunding effort, and then people start buying those tokens depending on their hopes and their trust in the value of the project, right? And then in the blockchain system, they have all these incentives, and the incentives are designed to align people, the miners, the developers, the investors. They're kind of okay. So this is the basic idea. My critique on them is that they mostly libertarians, anarcho-capitalist libertarians, and so they see the world as a collection of individuals. Which doesn't mean they're not innovating and doing interesting stuff, and it's really worth following it because that's, it's, to be honest, it's working. It's not that there's so many products that work, but they have succeeded in financing, all this infrastructure building. It's amazing what is happening in that field, and it's open source and it's community based. So that means that even if you fail, the software is available for the next generation who can do something different with it, right? Because a lot of things are too early. Think about now with delivering things at the home. All these companies who were doing that in 2001 went bankrupt. It was too early. But now with COVID, everybody knows we need it. It's the same thing, but now it works. It didn't work 20 years ago, right? So that's the reality. Sometimes people are too early, but if it's open source, you can reuse it later and it can be integrated in a new project. So one of the things that I'm doing is looking at more, holistic blockchain projects. So we look at projects like Economic Space Agency, Holochain, Commons Engine, Commons Stack, DAO Stack, and these are all projects that integrate commons thinking in their practice. So, for example, instead of a smart contract, you can have a Ostrom contract, which is a collective contract instead of individual to individual. Instead of a commodity currency, you can have a mutual credit currency, right? So you can at least have 10 criteria and say, okay, we'll do the same, but we'll tweak it to make it more social and more ecological. So I think in many ways, if you believe in the notion of class struggle, the class struggle today it's about design, because we live in virtual architectures, and the people who have a monopoly on designing the virtual architecture actually decide how you are going to live.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be engaged in value sensitive design, design that reflects positive social and ecological values. And unfortunately, that's why, technical people are so important nowadays, because they're kind of a vanguard, a labor aristocracy. And I always make the difference with the 19th century that, the farmers were expelled from their land. This is called the enclosure movement. And they got sent to the cities where they were basically starving and vagabonds, and they died when they were 31 in 1848 on average. Very bad things happened then. But the people who came from the crafts, the guild workers, they had education, they had remembrance of mutual solidarity systems. They're the ones who actually created the labor movement. It was not those poor subs
Mm-hmm.
who were kind of lost in the city and thought they were farmers. And no, these were the people. And I think today is the same. That's why today technical workers, you may not like it, but they have a very important role because they're designing the worlds in which we live. And if you look at the news today, whether it's GameStop or a lot of those things that happen with Trump and stuff, they're social media driven. They're driven by architectures that are invisible but really drive our behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting thoughts so far. As we coming to the end of our time for this call, I would like to ask you to not summarize, but to refer the work of peer-to-peer commons and the peer-to-peer foundation to the idea of connecting a network of networks. So for us as Co-Create, this is our vision, our mission, that we unite this network of networks to build this global or to connect these global infrastructures to empower and enable change makers to really drive for high impact. So how are you referring to this, and what do you think we still need to make this shift and to realize this connecting?
Good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I've tried many things myself, and that didn't always work. So one of the things that I did just until 2-3 years ago with the Common Strategies group was to bridge people that didn't understand each other. So the cooperative world didn't understand the commons, and vice versa. Actually, even the open hardware people didn't know the free software people, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So every 6 months, we did that about 10 times, I think. We brought people together for 3-4 days and, just let them talk freely. And this was amazing because a lot of things came out of this. Like once that was done, you could see like a year or two later that these people were working together, creating new projects. And unfortunately, I lost funding to do this because this is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
It was bringing 30 people for 30 days, for 3 days, but that's you have to pay their flights, and that was. So I think that was really something useful, even though it's not visible to the outside world. It creates a lot of interconnection. Um, Yeah, so platforms, I've become skeptical about platforms because there's so many of them and they usually don't last. They start with a big bang, a lot of money invested.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we really need to work on practical things, infrastructures. I'll give you an example what I think needs to happen. So if you leave your country to become a digital nomad, most people lose their social security. So why not create, global social security systems that work for digital nomads. And so you connect them through something that they all need, right? Um, and things that don't exist yet. And people, if you get sick and you don't have insurance, um, so it's not just about ideas and talking together. I think we also need to build these infrastructures, and many of the infrastructures that exist today are for profit and private and are slightly predatory. There's a lot of things, for example, to find apartments in the whole world. And I know some of them, and they always ask double the rent that I would pay otherwise. So I think we need more co-ops and stuff doing that. So I believe in planetary guilds, and creating infrastructures that work for the people who are doing this kind of work. Yeah, so I'm sorry I don't have like a magic wand to make us work together. Um, I think we have to slowly work, plant seeds, connect with each other, get to understand each other, and then sometimes things happen in the world, like non-linear change. And the reason we will succeed then is because we will have done the slow organizational work before. Because I'll give you an example. What doesn't work? Okay, Occupy. Fantastic experiment, but it couldn't last. It didn't have any infrastructure of solidarity. So it just completely collapsed. Then in Spain with 15M, most people were more clever. They went to the neighborhoods and started doing work in the neighborhoods. And then they created Encomu, and now they're in power. And they're really changing, the logic of the urban development in Barcelona, right? Because they were serious about building infrastructures and building communities and building movements. And then somehow it coalesced. So I think we just have to keep on trucking, do what we do it well, connect with each other, talk to each other, maybe create events, where we all come together, maybe create leagues of sympathetic organizations, and yeah, we have a big issue with funding though, that's a big issue. It's everybody's operating on shoestring basically.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. So I hear it, first of all, bringing different social bubbles together. I hear it at last is mentioned the issue of financial resources to really focus on topics and to really develop very concrete projects, like you mentioned, the infrastructures, which then help change makers in future as well. Yeah, can hear well. Thank you for pointing this out to me. Is there anything else you would like to share before we end? And if you're watching right now, this is your last chance to write a comment below. So that leads to us your questions or thoughts, which we are happy to pick up. So, Michel, anything, some last thoughts?
I'm just going to put a link in the chat, which is a chapter of what should be a textbook on commons economics, and it's an introduction to commons economics. And I think if people are interested in these ideas, that they would find it useful to have a look.
Perfect. I share it in the comments. Awesome. Thank you very much. So, to finish our conversation, we were speaking today with Michel Bauwens about the peer-to-peer foundation and concepts like commons and open source. I'm Hansi Herzog from Co-Create, the Global Co-Creation Challenge, and I'm really happy that we had the conversation. And Robert Schramm was watching. Thank you, Robert. Nice to see you. Showing up at all the videos. Very good. We're in contact. So it's really about, I'm feeling very much in this process of connecting different networks right now. I'm getting to know so many people and organizations working on that from different angles. So I'm really happy and grateful for that, and that we had the possibility to get to know us today. So looking forward to be more contact with you from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. Thank you very much for showing up.
Yeah,
If you
and looking forward to any cooperation and connection with people who listen to this conversation.
Cool. So we'll link you and your work up so they can find easily to you. And if you haven't had the chance yet to get more information about Co-Create and my work, please just have a look at the Global Co-Creation Challenge.net, and we're looking for we're looking for further conversations. And we start to invite to join our Patreon as well. So if you'd like to support us to do these interviews, we are very happy sharing the link down below. And for today, I wish you a great, awesome day. And yeah, let's join in. Let's come together to co-create a better life, a good life for all. Thank you all together. Bye bye.